it is the oil and fuel that is keeping the Russian war machine going at the moment. And if even people on the ground can't buy fuel to drive around the place, there will be a lot less to sell. And at least President Trump is putting pressure on the Indians in particular and some others not to buy Russian fuel. And if that is cut off, allied to the fact that the Saudis are increasing production, which is driving the price of oil below $40 a barrel. And at that price, world-renowned economists are saying that the Russian economy can't keep going, and not even Putin can make bombs and bullets without fuel. So, yeah, I think this is a pretty smart move by the Ukrainians.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Hamish De Bretton-Gordon, former commander of the UK's Joint Chemical, Biological and Nuclear Regiment. He's a military commentator and very much a friend of the show. Hamish, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I wanted to start, Hamish, with reports that a Russian nuclear power plant in Kursk was struck by a Ukrainian drone. It was damaged a transformer and apparently slowed auxiliary power to the station. How dangerous is it when a nuclear power plant is hit like this?
Well, it can be dangerous, and the whole nuclear issue has figured so very large in this conflict. We've spoken many times about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is this massive power station that hasn't produced power really since the Russian invasion. There's been a lot of alleged strikes on it, potential damage, cutting off the power to it. One of the big issues with power stations like this is even if they are not producing power, if the reactors are switched off, if you like, or turned down, they still need a lot of power to keep the nuclear fuel rods at a subcritical temperature. In other words, keep them cooled. These power stations have many different sort of supplies, generators, but we've seen a number of times in Zaporizhzhia where all the power supplies have been hit and gone down, and then you potentially get a problem where the fuel rods could become critical. You could have an explosion and a fire, then contamination. And nobody needs reminding what happened in Chernobyl, just near Kyiv back in the 80s, and spread contamination all over Europe, and quite a lot of it came to the UK. So, yeah, any of these, any events at nuclear power stations can be terrible. Having said all that, these power stations have been around for a long time. Safety is key. Even in Russia, safety will be key. And although the Kursk power station is quite an old one, the Russians have used it more for propaganda, like we're hearing at the moment, that a Ukrainian drone hit it. There is no hard and fast evidence that has happened. Although Ukraine is doing some devastating deep attacks into Russia, mainly focused at the oil industry, they would gain very little. In fact, they would lose a hell of a lot if they created some sort of contamination, nuclear disaster around Kursk. So, yeah, I think this is part of the massive Russian disinformation and propaganda piece. It's a way for them to try and demonstrate that they are holier than thou and the Ukrainians are dreadful. Whereas, of course, generally it's the other way around. So I think there's probably a lot of smoke about this and not a lot of fire.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, how does that happen, and are there not rules to stop weapons of war being flown so close to these power stations? Russia has said the drone was shot down, and that is why it landed where it did. Although that's a term they use quite often when there are strikes in Russia. That term falling debris rather than the missile or weapon striking itself. But it sounds like you think that it may not be the case that there was an attack or a drone at all.
Well, I'm very sceptical, and I very much doubt if it was a direct attack by the Ukrainians. That's not the sort of thing they've done. It would unlikely to cause any significant damage, except sort of psychologically, bonus for the Russians. it's easy for them to paint it. But your first point is absolutely spot on. There are rules. The Geneva Conventions, which cover the rules of war, and rules of war, when you're talking about the Russians, does seem a bit of a chimera or anathema because they don't seem to follow any of them. But yeah, the Geneva Conventions protect a whole bunch of places. Nuclear power stations are absolutely part of it. Religious sites, schools, and hospitals are all protected under the Geneva Conventions. But I saw at first hand in Syria, actually the Russians directly attacked, particularly hospitals and schools, as part of their campaign. And we've seen exactly the same in Ukraine. So, yeah, it's pretty rich for the Russians to claim that this is an attack against the Geneva Convention or the rules of war. It seems more likely that if it was a Ukrainian drone, it was heading elsewhere. As the Russians said, shot it down. The debris happened to fall in the Kursk power station. So, yeah, something out of nothing, I think. But if Russia is now going to abide by the Geneva Conventions and the rules of war, the Chemical Weapons Convention, which we've spoken about a lot, Russia's still using industrial amounts of chemical weapons on the front lines, which we might come on to, then that's great. Everybody would applaud at least a little bit the Kremlin if they did follow the rules of war, which hitherto they've completely ignored.
And elsewhere, Ukraine also hit in a long-range strike the Ust-Luga refinery, all the way up near the Gulf of Finland. How should we assess Ukraine's long-range strike campaign, do you think, Hamish? Because, it's not had the same impact as Russia's own long-range campaign hitting Kiev and other major cities in Ukraine. But, fuel prices in Russia have inflated significantly this summer. If at the pump fuel prices go up, can that have an impact on the cost of running vehicles and other equipment in the conflict itself for the Russians?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think actually the Ukrainians' long range strike has been pretty successful. It's been fairly muted. They haven't shouted about it like the Russians do. But if you think back to Operation Spider's Web, where they destroyed about a third of the Russians' long range strategic bombers, thousands of miles from the Ukraine border, that had a huge impact. Made Russia move a whole lot of other kit further and further east. I mean, it's, a lot of the Russian strategic kit and submarines and aircraft are now closer to Alaska than they are to Ukraine. So in that guise, I think it's been very effective. Also, as you said, attacking the oil industry, particularly refining, the fact has two impacts. We are now seeing, even on Russian social media, massive queues of cars trying to get fuel. Even if they can get it, the price has gone through the roof. And I think this is another sort of drip that the Russian people, the rank and file, I don't suppose any of Putin's oligarchs are queuing for fuel or can't afford to buy bread and potatoes like a lot of people. But yeah, this is all having a really big impact. We know that the economy is struggling. We know the inflation is plus of 25%. Interest rates are very high. Unfortunately, Russia is not a democracy. It might be called the Russian Federation. It's not called the Russian Democratic Federation. The only people who really matter in Russia when it comes to the leadership are Putin, and his close allies and oligarchs. Although each year there does seem to be election, which Putin gets 99% of. Those people queuing for fuel have very little to do with it. But I think it is a really smart move because it is the oil and fuel that is keeping the Russian war machine going at the moment. And if even people on the ground can't buy fuel to drive around the place, there will be a lot less to sell. And at least President Trump is putting pressure on the Indians in particular and some others not to buy Russian fuel. And if that is cut off, allied to the fact that the Saudis are increasing production, which is driving the price of oil below $40 a barrel. And at that price, world-renowned economists are saying that the Russian economy can't keep going, and not even Putin can make bombs and bullets without fuel. So, yeah, I think this is a pretty smart move by the Ukrainians. they're doing they're very inventive. A lot of these long range strikes are with kit they've made themselves, sort of, big drones that they've manufactured. We're hearing that they've now produced their own cruise missile, which looks really good bit of kit. And they've claimed some of the strikes that we're talking about are by this new Ukrainian missile. So yeah, it is having an effect, and no doubt they will keep doing it, because that is probably the main way that Ukraine can try and affect the war, rather than just keeping to fight on the front lines, which are pretty static anyway.
Well, and meanwhile, elsewhere, of course, we're now about a week out from that meeting with Trump and other European leaders at the White House following the summit with Vladimir Putin in Alaska. Not a huge amount of movement. What impact that has had, if any, remains to be seen. But one thing that did move a little was the US on this idea of European and security guarantees, the possibility of boots on the ground as well. In your assessment, Hamish, what do you think Europe can provide for Ukraine in terms of security guarantees right now?
Well, I think quite a lot. Just before I go on to that, just turning back to the summit, it was very interesting to hear Kaja Kallas, the sort of senior EU diplomat, at the end of last week, saying, well, actually, President Putin got all that he could ever have dreamed of from that summit. He didn't want sanctions. He hasn't got sanctions. He's welcome back onto the world stage. You get a big pat on the back from Trump. And his maximalist claims for a peace deal or he didn't want a ceasefire, and Trump's now agreed with him. No, we won't have a ceasefire. We'll have a peace deal. And his peace deal has not changed since the day that he started the war on the 24th of February 2022. So actually, we're in a hell of a position. I think the other thing to really concern, we haven't heard from Trump for a week. He, after that meeting 10 days ago, he said, right, Zelensky and Putin will meet, now, sort of any day. Now, what we're hearing out of the Kremlin, certainly from Sergei Lavrov, the rather eccentric foreign minister, is that there is no chance of peace. We need to have loads of other meetings to discuss detail. So pushing it all into the long grass. When it comes to what Europe can do, I mean, it seems pretty clear that, and certainly I think Pete Hesketh, the defense secretary, US defense secretary, and Trump have all also confirmed there will be no US boots on the ground in Ukraine. And that's fair enough. What is essential is that the Americans provide a sort of backstop, which they say they will do, even saying that they will do a sort of Article 5 backstop for Ukraine, although they appear to road back on that a little bit. But as long as American air power and American intelligence is still available, then Europe needs to come up with the boots on the ground. And absolutely, I mean, I've written about this in some detail. A lot of work, we understand, has been done, and Admiral Radican, the Chief of Defence Staff for the UK, was in the US last week, tying up the details with other European military leaders on this. The size of the force it's difficult to say exactly, but we're probably talking about 40,000 sort of combat troops in Ukraine that could then deploy very quickly to plug any gaps, or if there is any transgressions. And when it comes to air power, actually NATO European countries, especially now that Finland and Sweden are part of it, really do have enough air power. There are a lot of F-35 jets in European countries, fourth, fifth generation stealth jets that vastly overmatch anything Russia has. So, I am pretty confident that actually Europe can come up with the combat hardware, the boots on the ground and the boots in the air, if you like, to police any sort of ceasefire, and also the naval capability, because no doubt the Black Sea will become a very important area. What people have to remember is it's all very well putting a force of, say, 40,000 on the ground. Actually, you need a force 3 times the size to maintain it, because you're always going to have a force that's training, ready to go, and then you'll have a force that's just left. So for 40,000 troops on the ground, you need 120,000, which seems a lot. But between the UK, the Germans, and the French in particular, plus the Nordic countries, then certainly we are more than capable of doing it, and the professionalism of the army and the kit, again, is far superior to anything that Russia has. But we still need the US backstop. The final piece on this, Louis, is we're unlikely to see any of the Baltic states. I mean, Lithuania in particular is building a 30-mile defensive border with Belarus. They're very concerned the Russians might try and come through there. And of course, Lithuania has Kaliningrad, the Russian enclave, sort of behind it. And there's a concern that the Russians will try and link up there. So we probably won't see any Baltic states, but within the others, there are plenty of forces. And of course, whatever criticisms we might have of President Trump, he has made Europe look up and realize that it needs to spend a heck of a lot of money to provide a credible conventional deterrence, so that if Putin is stopped where he is discouraged from going any further in future, which is a huge concern. And I share Christopher Steele, who used to be the MI6 security service lead on Russia, saying any pause will allow Russia to rebuild. And we must be wary of that. The way to stop it is to have such a strong conventional force in Europe that he won't come up, because when he looked west on the 24th of February 2022, we were asleep. We were not paying attention.
And you mentioned the possibility of US air power as well. That's something that Trump himself seemed open to last week. What is it that the US would be doing as a backstop, seeing as it is something they're now more on board with? I mean, is it just a matter of European troops slotting into that chain of command that we assume is there in Kiev with American assistance for the Ukrainians, or would it be a new system that led this, or something more like a NATO chain of command?
Well, I think there will be various options looked at. I expect what would be required is the NATO chain of command. In other words, we have a peace enforcement force of NATO troops who the majority will probably be in Ukraine somewhere, but they will ready to move if there is an incursion by the Russians across, the line of demarcation, the demilitarized zone, or whatever they're going to call it. The sort of option that actually they fit in to support the Ukrainians is a sort of step further, which in effect would actually bring NATO directly into conflict with Russia. So with a peace enforcement force, the troops are there to deter mainly, and actually if they don't deter them, they've probably failed. But really, if there is any seepage, then the force would push that back. This is defensive. The option to become offensive and directly supporting the Ukrainians, is really, I would have thought, the last resort if Russia keeps on fighting. So I think the former, it'll be a NATO chain of command. We talk about the American backstop. We're talking about the massive American air power that they have available, and a lot of it is based in Europe, so they don't need to forward base it. And it's it's an insurance policy. Even given all Putin's bravado and the bravado of his close supporters like Lavrov and Peskov and Medvedev, they know that the US Air Force is, the Russian Air Force is no match for the US Air Force, and they would be obliterated if they went up against them. And of course, Trump demonstrated that with the attack on Iran, a few months ago, destroying a lot of its nuclear facilities, which were protected by Russian air defense and Russian fighter jets that didn't even put a scratch on the Americans. So, those are the two options, I think, and hopefully it will be just a peace enforcement force that the Russians will look at and say, right, okay, we'll stop there. We won't test them.
And it's becoming, it seems to be becoming increasingly more likely that there will eventually be European troops on Ukrainian soil, Western forces on Ukrainian soil. What does that mean that we're sort of moving in that direction for Russia's overall objectives and reason for starting this conflict?
Well, again, it's a really tricky place to get to. And of course, this weekend, again, we've heard out of the Kremlin saying that NATO troops would be unacceptable in Ukraine. It's part of their they're unachievable for Ukraine aims for a peace deal. The peace deal is they want the whole of the Donbass, a whole bunch of other areas in Kherson and Kharkiv and Zaporizhia, no NATO troops in Ukraine, no prospect of Ukraine joining NATO or the European Union, and a reduction of Ukraine's army. I mean, virtually nothing in there is any way close to what Zelensky has said he will agree to, or the Ukrainian people will agree to. So it is almost inevitable that NATO troops are going to have to go on the ground in Ukraine. I expect to protect it, but we're hoping in a peace enforcement role rather than actually an offensive role to support Ukraine, because that would be a very different prospect. But I think NATO really needs to, and I say in my piece today, we need to, in Europe, flex the one muscle that has resonance in the Kremlin, and that's our military muscle, because I believe we vastly overmatched the Russians. And when you just look at, Putin is talking about having the whole of the Donbass. Well, the MOD intelligence update are saying 4 years to do it and another 2 million casualties. It's just not going to happen. And I think we need to be bold. Unfortunately, till quite recently, a lot of European leaders have really been cowed and terrified by Putin. Even President Trump seemed to walk in his shadow in Alaska. But it is now time that the collective might of Europe needs to really stand up and be counted, and the Kremlin needs to understand that they will yield no further.
Yeah, and speaking about that wider European support, the stuff that is going on at the moment, Zelensky has said he wants to secure at least $1 billion on a monthly basis from allies to purchase US weapons. How much of a difference would it make if Ukraine can secure a more consistent flow of weapons at the moment?
Well, that is really important. We've seen too often where frontline unit appear to have run out of ammunition or artillery shells, or can only fire one artillery shell for every 5 or 6 the Russians firing. That is not a way to conduct a war, and that's what we're talking about. So, the Ukrainians should have enough ammunition that they need, and it's clear at the moment they don't. It's clear they're getting through air defense missiles, in particular, at a devastating rate, and conversely, Russia is increasing its use of drones and missiles against civilian targets. So it is absolutely essential. And I expect in the sort of sophisticated long-range missiles like ATACMS, like the British Storm Shadow, the Taurus missiles, if Ukraine had a decent stock of them, they could make a huge difference. We've talked about their strikes on the oil and fuel industry, but actually, if they could double or triple that, they could make a lot more progress. So the fact that they have to buy the stuff off the Americans, that seems to be the price of doing business with President Trump. But so be it. And one wouldn't have thought that $1 million or €1 million a month is beyond the capability of the European countries to provide. So let's hope that does happen, and the flow of weapons that Ukraine needs increases to a point where they can start sort of dominating the Russians rather than just sort of trying to survive.
And as we mentioned earlier, Ukraine are building a new missile of sorts, a cruise missile that they've named the Flamingo missile. But does Ukraine generally have the capacity to produce these missiles en masse domestically, do you think? And how challenging is that when you're under bombardment daily?
Well, I think we've all been really impressed by the innovation of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian defense industry. I mean, they have produced some really, really stunning kit, and I think this Flamingo cruise missile is that. And Ukraine has always produced great engineers, and it is the Antonov aircraft industry is Ukrainian. Most of the Russian jets are in effect Ukrainian. So Ukraine has a real sort of history, and a lot of the tanks, the T-34 tank, a lot of the more modern tanks, T-80s, 90s, were designed and originally built in Ukraine. So, one of the reasons, of course, Putin is so keen to get Ukraine back, not just for its natural resources, particularly in the Donbass, but also its engineering capability. So, slightly long-winded answer to your question, I'm absolutely sure that Ukraine can produce these Flamingo missiles, in numbers, and it's probably a very sophisticated bit of kit. No doubt, they've had some help from, technical help from the West as well. So yeah, I think it's the fact that we're all talking about it, and the fact that Ukraine is making a big thing about it, sort of leads me to believe that actually people think this is the real deal. And I expect, and also Ukraine's on a war economy. They are sort of turning plowshares into tanks, sort of thing, for want of a better vernacular. But yeah, when national survival is what you're facing, then quite frankly, you've got to do it. If it means making less luxury items, then so be it. So I expect a lot of industry is focused on this, and as I said, I'm very confident the Ukrainians are well up to the task.
And as you say, that war is continuing on the ground in Ukraine as well. We did see a series of raids that developed around Pokrovsk into a sort of offensive. Ukraine has now blunted that push by the Russians and largely tied up and stopped that from advancing as significantly as it was. How crucial is it that Ukraine is able to do that, move troops around to stop these pushes by the Russians when they happen?
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. And the fact they've done it is reassuring. The Russians have made a lot about this, but we're talking about fairly small, isolated operations. Russia is talking about its great motorbike troops, as they call them, where 100 blokes on motorbikes steam through minefields that don't get blown up because the motorbikes aren't heavy enough, and break through the lines. But 99% of those motorbikes and people on them are either killed or captured, and they might hold a bit of ground for a few hours, but that doesn't happen. We've talked before of the massive use of chemical weapons, chloropicrine. Again, same deal. Use a lot of that, gain a bit of space, but then going back again. And I think all the observers in the US and around the place who are looking at this closely would say, the front lines have changed very, very little in the last 18 months. There are a few pushes here and there, but around Petrovsk, where so much fighting has gone on, the Russians might own one street today, but they'll lose it tomorrow. So I don't think any of the incursions by the Russians will have a strategic or even a significant local impact. But it is key that the Ukrainians maintain the ability to move forces around and plug any gaps, which they seem to be able to do. And it's really tough, but they're just about managing it. But I don't expect to see any big breakthroughs. And I agree with the UK MOD assessment that the Russians, if they take the whole of the Donbass, which they want, is going to take them a heck of a long time, and they're going to lose a lot of people doing it.
And elsewhere in eastern Ukraine, the Russians continue to advance into Dnipropetrovsk region, which is not a region they lay claim to, or one they've voiced any interest in annexing, as they have attempted to do with other regions. The town of Zaporizhzhia was taken by Russia just today, according to the Russian military, of course. I mean, is any land taken a victory? Is there a strategy here for Ukraine of focus on certain areas that might be more strategically important, or they don't think they're going to get back?
Well, that might be the case. That's on the assumption that the Russian high command have a grand strategic plan, which is what we would call, the maneuverist approach, the sort of thinking back to philosophers like Sun Tzu and others, and Clausewitz. But there has been no evidence of this. Most of the Russian attacks have been very, very blunt, very static, very sort of straight up the middle, no maneuver involved, just pouring more and more troops into what's being called the meat grinder, which is pretty much what happened, how the Russians fought in the Second World War. I mean, the Russians lost 26 million people in the Second World War. Britain lost 245,000. In comparison, and Britain, we would like to think we were much more manoeuvrous the way we fought in North Africa, the way we fought in Normandy and across the Low Countries. So it's very easy to sort of navel gaze at these things and perhaps come up with some brilliant plan the Russians are doing, but that would be a surprise. I think they might take the odd opportunity, but I suppose the final bit on this, it's the way that Russia command and control operations, particularly within the army. Nobody is allowed to make any important decision at a low level. Everything has to be passed back up the chain of command. What that means is that innovation is stifled. The ability to take an opportunity, if it suddenly appears, you can't do it. And basically, people are terrified of their superiors. And ultimately, of course, Putin gets involved in what we'd call very low-level tactical decisions, which, if you imagine how long it takes from a platoon or a company of, say, 100 men fighting near Petrovsk to get a decision back from the Kremlin, hundreds of miles away, we're talking days here. And in my experience on the battlefield, opportunities are usually fleeting. And, in an hour's time, they might have gone. In a couple of days' time, their history. So, I think the Russians are just doing what they've always done. Just keep, using manpower and using equipment and not worrying about casualties, collateral damage. I mean, the final bit, we understand the Russians have lost nearly 6,000 tanks in this war, which, when you think the British Army has just over 100 tanks, slightly puts it into perspective.
And of course, over the weekend, it's been the Ukrainian Independence Day. President Zelensky, speaking at the independence ceremony in Kyiv, said that Ukraine has not yet won, but it has not lost. Is there an end in sight yet, do you think, to this war, militarily or otherwise, Hamish, as Donald Trump might have us believe?
Well, I think everybody is hoping so. I mean, the irony cannot be lost on anybody that, yesterday was the celebration of Independence Day from the Soviet Union, whereas Putin is trying to rebuild the Soviet Union, and Ukraine is absolutely part of that. Things seem to ebb and flow. If we were talking last weekend with all Trump's bravado, we would have had Putin and Zelensky meet this week. There'd be a peace deal signed next week, and there would be a NATO peace enforcement force in the week after, and peace would come out. Alaska summit seems a heck of a long way away at the moment. Even the meeting of the European leaders in Washington 10 days ago or a week ago seems a heck of a long time ago. I think there must be hope. If Trump really does flex his military muscles, and Europe keeps going and is united, then there should be a chance. But I think people have got to realize that Putin is not a sort of a leader that we would recognize or understand in the West. He is absolutely a dictator. He sees himself as the modern day Tsar, and he has said that he would subjugate Ukraine completely and he would restore the Soviet Union. He knows if he doesn't do that, he is going to go the way of a lot of Russian leaders and Russian senior people. We could count, probably up to 100 senior Russians who have died mysteriously in the last 4 or 5 years. So when you look at that, you can see why Putin keeps going. And of course, he all the pressure that's put on him by Trump and others seems to be completely water off a duck's back, and he keeps going. And I think if we try and assume that Russians think the same way we do, then we and the Ukrainians are going to fail. And I think basically we have got to make it so difficult or unpleasant for Putin to keep going that he does sue for peace. But that's going to take a determined effort, particularly by President Trump, who unfortunately seems to switch ideas and switch what he's doing on a daily basis. And the last person who spoke to him is the person he seems to agree with or like the most. And at the moment, psychologically, that's probably Putin.
Hamish De Bretton-Gordon, former commander of the UK's Joint Chemical, Biological and Nuclear Regiment, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Thank you very much for having me.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.